Hello and welcome to Thursdays for the Soul. My name is Jennifer White and I am your host for today. Thursdays for the Soul is a webinar series for the whole church where we faithfully focus on care and education for the people of God. And we create opportunities to digitally worship together as the whole of the United Church of Christ. From prayer to music to psalms to key interview leaders and how-tos in congregational life. This series stays current to the relevant topics of the time and offers opportunities of connection in the wider church and in your community. Together, we can bring our church and the world towards the world God imagines for all of us. We have some upcoming sessions. Thursday, September 29th, we will have Preparing for Advent 2022, Days to Come. The United Church of Christ partners with the United Church of Canada to offer a collection of resources for the Advent season. From devotionals to candle lighting rituals for individuals and for communal worship. We will have resources ready for your faith communities. Join us for an overview of the collection and a preview of a new song. October 13th, we will have intergenerational Advent planning. We'll join members of AUSSE, the Association of United Church Educators Board of Directors, as they share about faith formation during Advent. There will be ideas from intergenerational Advent activities, Advent resources, and ways to collect ideas. We'll also touch on intergenerational ministries, creative planning strategies, and practices of online faith formation. We're familiar with that, right? As usual, you can visit ucc.org or any of our social media platforms to find out about more sessions like this. Friends, my beloveds, if these conversations move you, if what's offered here helps enhance your ministry or your soul, please consider donating towards the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your prayerful and financial support helps programs just like this in the essential work of the United Church of Christ. Thank you. Thank you for all that you do. Today's program is Shared Learning from Gun Violence Ministries. It may look a little different than the title that you may have registered for or see on YouTube right now. That is because we had to make some changes per the request of this particular group. They will expound on that later in this. Although it would have been very easy to be overwhelmed with the complexity and scope of gun violence prevention, faith leaders in Colorado said, we must do something. So join me as we hear from these faith leaders who will share their experiences, lessons learned, and best practices in transforming trauma and catalyzing a nationwide movement. Beloveds, I want to make space for my dear friend, Kathy Stutzman, the Social Action Commission Chair of Community UCC in Boulder, Colorado. Kathy, welcome.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm Kathy Stutzman, and I'm here to share a little bit about what started us here on this journey. In response to a mass shooting at our neighborhood grocery store, where 10 people were killed on March 22nd, 2021, we resolved to find a way to move beyond thoughts and prayers. We were shocked, grieving, and had quickly turned to anger and outrage. We were told nothing could be done, that no matter what we did, nothing would change. And we were not satisfied with that. We were not satisfied with being just another statistic. Although it truly would have been easy to be overwhelmed with that complexity of what gun violence prevention is, we knew we must do something, anything, and we have to start now, today, at that moment. We started by listening. We asked our community one question. If you could be king or queen for the day and could decree one thing be done about gun violence, what would you do? It was an amazing question. 65 people participated in our listening circles, and the responses were beautiful and varied and innovative. And yet there was one theme that remained constant. Every group named turning swords into plowshares and gun buybacks. the groundswell began. During that time, the universe connected us with Mike Martin, who you're going to meet in a moment, founder of Raw Tools, whose foundation is from the book of Isaiah, where we read, God shall judge between the nations and shall decide for many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. We chose to use our anger to fuel our faith in God and humanity. And on June 13th, 2021, less than 3 months after the massacre, we convened a first ever Guns to Garden event hosted by a faith community. On that day, we took 31 unwanted firearms, drawing from the commitment of over 50 volunteers from our congregation and other faith communities. We prayed, we cried, we sang, we marched, we listened to beautiful stories as guns were reduced to parts on chop saws. It feels significant to take scripture like this seriously and literally, and sometimes it leads to a movement. We've been transformed as a faith community. This is both a pastoral and prophetic ministry. And I wonder what all the kings and queens in your community would dream if asked. And now, the Reverend Jackie Hibbard.
Thanks, Kathy. I'm the Reverend Jackie Hibbard. I'm the associate pastor at Community United Church of Christ. And on that day that Kathy mentioned, March 22nd, 2021, the unthinkable happened in our neighborhood, literally right down the street from our church building. Our neighborhood grocery store experienced a terrible, terrible day. We lost friends. We lost a beloved police officer who had been helpful to our congregation during a time of a hate crime that we experienced. And 10 beautiful people lost their lives, either because they showed up for work or because they were in the grocery store. And that afternoon, as it was happening, I started calling some of our folks in the neighborhood just to check in. Are you okay? Were you there? Are you home? What's happening for you? And as I listened, I learned that we had one person who had literally just left that grocery store, just had pulled out of the parking lot. We had another person who was standing at the bus stop in front of the store and heard all the shots. We had another family that decided to shop at the new Whole Foods next door, but it was their shopping time at that King Soopers, but they were at the new store. So we had these stories of near misses of our congregation. Fortunately, none of our folks were shot that day, but all of us were affected. Now, our congregation has been involved in gun violence prevention, whether it's working on suicide prevention at the state level. We've had people who have testified at the Boulder City Council for gun violence prevention and safe and smart gun safety laws. We have been supporters of Colorado Faith Communities United Against Gun Violence. We've marched, we've demonstrated, we've done all that, but that day and all those near misses turned the tide. And like Kathy said, we knew something had to be different, something had to be done. And so we set out on a movement, not knowing what would happen. And fortunately, we were able to meet Mike Martin, and I'm going to turn it over to him right now from Raw Tools, and take it away, Mike.
Thanks, Jackie. It's great to be with you all. I have a great affinity for the UCC Church. I'm a licensed minister for the specific ministry of Raw Tools within the Mennonite Church here in Colorado Springs. And it's just been a joy to kind of walk this path with the people on this call at various points over the last 2 years. So I wanted to kind of set the stage from a national perspective of the gun violence that is happening in America. I co-wrote a book, Beating Guns, Hope for People Who Are Weary of Violence, in 2019. And sadly, I've had to update all of these statistics in a in the wrong direction since then. The pandemic had a tragic impact on gun violence in our country over the last 2 years. So I want us to also hold kind of the tragedy of that, but also try and keep in the back of your mind, not just in this section, but throughout this call, artistic expressions of transformation and how that has made space for new things in your life. So I'm going to be reading through these statistics, and just it does kind of pull us down, but keep things in the back of your mind of positive transformations, especially from an artistic perspective, to kind of keep us level in a way. There are nearly 5 times more gun dealers than McDonald's in the United States. There are more gun dealers in the United States than Starbucks in the entire world. In 2020, the CDC reported we had over 40,000 gun deaths, and it's estimating nearly 49,000 in 2021. At 40,000, that's 110 per day. The leading cause of death for kids is now gun violence. It used to be car accidents. That's over 10 kids per day. Or as I try to remind people that that's a Sandy Hook elementary school every other day, 20 more kids. On top of that, about 80,000 gun injuries in addition to the deaths each year. So we often focus on the deaths caused by firearms, but we have to remember that there are nearly twice as many injuries that often lead to life-altering circumstances for people that they have to survive and live through. Every minute, a gun is stolen in the United States. Every 3 seconds, a new gun is made. 3% of gun owners account for almost half of all the guns owned in the United States. 2/3 of gun violence is suicide. Across the country, somewhere between 60 and 70% of gun violence is suicide. A little bit about that. You often hear that where there are more guns, there is more gun violence. And what we see with suicide in other spaces, what we need to hear is where there are more guns, there is more lethal violence. 90% of suicide attempts by gun end in death, where the next most popular method is 50%. And the most common method, 5 to 10% attempts end in death. A gun in the home triples the risk of suicide. 80% of kids who attempt with a gun use a family member's gun. Military service members are more likely to die at home than they are in combat. One of the other things I learned while writing Beating Guns is that only 5%, maybe a little bit more than that, of gun owners are part of the NRA. So that's another thing to keep in mind as we talk about this, that gun owners are not a monolith. They do not all believe the same way. And many of us on this call are in relationship and work very closely with responsible gun owners who do this work, who are very adamant about gun safety. And so to keep that in mind, that the NRA might have the loudest and most funded voice, but it does not speak for all gun owners. I want to bring in Reverend Chris Gilmore here to speak about the impact of bringing some of these practices into his community.
Thank you, Mike. My name is Chris Gilmore. I'm the lead pastor at 6th Avenue United Church of Christ here in Denver, Colorado. A local church and 6th Avenue sponsored a gun buyback with raw tools in January of this year. And we combined it with a worship service beforehand where we had a victim of gun violence share her story in a very powerful way. It ended the service by going into our gym at the church, and there Raw Tools has set up a way in which they would take an actual gun and we could actually hammer it and create it into a garden tool. And one of the rituals that they often do is to invite those who have some type of story of impact, their life's been impacted by gun violence, to hammer first. And as a pastor, I was shocked at how many members of the congregation I serve had stories about their lives being impacted by gun violence. A family member that was injured by a gun, a friend who had died by suicide by a gun. As I watched different members of the congregation come forward and pound away at the gun, pastorally, I was reminded, I guess, of just how much of an issue this is in our lives today. And I think it becomes part of what it means to be a church, is to say we have to address this. It becomes not just a social justice issue, but a pastoral issue. So many of the people in our lives have had their lives affected by gun violence. If you wanted to add anything, Mike, that you've seen in other churches. But as a pastor, this was a very prophetic and pastoral issue that came forward.
One of the things that Raw Tools likes to do is try and connect church and faith communities to folks in their community who've been impacted by gun violence, not just to help turn guns into garden tools like we did at that demonstration at 6th Avenue, but also from the beginning of the process where you can cut up firearms. We often involve folks who've been impacted to help destroy firearms at buybacks, or we have a national network of volunteers that help people who fill out a form on our website to donate a gun. Then we connect them to volunteers who then help them do that. And we had a recent one just 2 weeks ago here in Colorado Springs where a man lost his 14-year-old son to suicide who used his AR-15. And then later his second wife used his handgun. And so he had lost 2 people to firearm suicide over a span of years. And our local Pikes Peak suicide prevention group reached out to him and asked if he would donate those to us. And so we disabled them, and he was there and had a little ritual of his own, placing his hand on the gun that took his son's life before we cut it up. And then this last Sunday morning, there was a race against suicide, a 5K, and that AR-15 was made into a shovel that he used to help plant a tree in honor of his son, and it will be used every year from here on out. So we try and involve communities and access to this transition from sword to plowshare as a way of welcoming them into not just a way to grieve in a healthy way, but also to heal in a hopeful way. And that it's really important to add that pastoral and ministry aspect to what's going on in gun violence that we can so often lose within policy and advocacy conversations. Thanks, Chris, for making space in your church for that, much like the others on this call have done too. Just like Reverend Sarah Verasco, who's next here.
Thank you, Mike and Chris. My name is Sarah Verasco. I'm one of the authorized ministers at First Congregational United Church of Christ in Longmont, Colorado. And Longmont is a town that is deeply divided. We have areas in our town where there are often demonstrations, and there is a designated place for counter demonstrations. And so in Longmont, our congregation has taken an approach that strives to be pastoral and practical at the same time. The question of have you been or how have you been impacted by gun violence is an important question. And another question that we ask is, do you own guns? Are there guns in your home? And as a pastor, that question comes up at different points in life cycle events like baptisms and confirmations. It comes up at times when people are choosing to be married, or when there are people that are dealing with addiction and mental health challenges. It comes up when there are people that are newly diagnosed with dementia, because all of those moments increase the potential for harm and decisions that are not made with sort of sound, rational thinking. And so part of our ministry has been to engage in the opportunity for people to turn in unwanted guns and to turn those into garden tools. We call them buybacks, but they're really more like donation centers. People don't know how to get rid of guns or Bibles or flags. And so we try to make it easy. If you have a gun that you don't want, we will take it. We'll also take your Bibles, but That's a very different process. So I also want to add that this is not a ministry I would have chosen. I was very much pulled into this and claimed for this ministry through a story of impact. It was through a teenager in a congregation where I was serving in Connecticut who accidentally shot himself and died. His name now is a name that most political leaders know. His name is Ethan Song, and he is behind, his life story is behind much of the safe storage legislation, both locally and nationally throughout the country, and that was the work of his parents. And I think what helped me to go from impact to pastoral and practical was I saw Ethan's parents standing on the steps of the church, of their church, which was the church we shared together. And his father held up a gun safe. And he said, I'm not telling you you can't own guns. What I'm asking you to do is to store them so that kids can't get them and kids don't have access to them. And so when I saw a parent who, in my mind, had every right to say, let's get rid of every gun that exists, say, I'm not asking you to get rid of your guns. I'm asking you to store them safely. It really changed my heart and forced me to acknowledge that I could do this too. And so in Longmont, we give away gun safes. We give away quick access gun safes. We don't ask questions. We interact with people that we typically don't interact with, people we don't see on Sunday morning, people that sometimes are on the other side of the street during protest times. And it really has opened up my heart and the heart of this congregation in a new way. Here's something we learned from someone who came to pick up a safe at our last giveaway. She was walking away, and I was just going to relieve someone who was standing out in the street with a sign that said free gun safes. And she said, and she was crying. So I just went up to her and I said, what's going on? And she said, well, you know, I had a career in law enforcement, but I was an administrator. And down the street from where I live was a police officer who came home late one night and didn't lock up his gun. And his 3-year-old daughter got access to the gun and accidentally killed herself. She said, I had no idea that a 3-year-old could pull a trigger. And I walk by that house every day. And she came to pick up a safe. You know, what's interesting to me is that we don't know what moves people to take another step towards safety or to take another step toward removing guns from the home. Everyone has their own sort of initiation into this kind of consciousness and an entree into this movement. At one of our buybacks, there was a church member who was so eager to get rid of his guns that I actually made the mistake of thinking he got rid of all of his guns, and he didn't. He got rid of 3 of his guns. And then when our second buyback came along, he shared with me a conversation that he had with his wife. See, this man had been military trained, and he believed something that I believe to be one of the great lies of our country, that guns keep us safer, and that it's his job to keep his family safe, and the way to do that is with a gun. And so he went to his wife and he said, because it kept nagging at him. I mean, that's the way this ministry claims your heart, isn't it? It just keeps nagging and doesn't go away. And so he said to her, if I get rid of this gun, I'm not going to be able to protect you if something were to happen and democracy were to crumble. And he said, would you be okay with that? And she said, yes, I would. And so he turned in his last weapon. So having seen enough people who come to this step by step, increment by increment, myself included. Our commitment to making sure that we meet people where they are is the foundation of
You cut out there at the end, I guess. Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you so much for all that has already been shared. I'm Nicola Marsh, pastor of Community United Church of Christ, based here in Boulder, Colorado. And I so appreciate what you said, Sarah, about having this kind of claim you. And I really resonate with that. I grew up in a culture very much infused with guns, and watched a much loved classmate accidentally kill a sibling, and as part of all that. And so my family's in a really different place with guns, and so I wasn't necessarily something I would pick either for a ministry. But I have to say that I believe and kind of witnessed with all this that whatever name we have for God, it was absolutely guiding us, luring us to this, connecting all of us with one another. It became so much bigger than any of us. So I see that as a sign that it's a God thing that we're a part of. So Kathy mentioned the listening circles that we did. And so that was sort of happening. We did 3 of those, and that was happening kind of, behind the scenes, and part of what we wanted to do right away in terms of creating space for all of our congregation to share. And on Friday, April 2nd, which was Good Friday of Holy Week, a few weeks after the massacre happened, my friend Randy Spalding, who's the pastor of the Mennonite Church, held a demonstration with Mike and Raw Tools. And we marched from our building to that site, sort of in the spirit of Good Friday. And I will never forget what it felt like, what it smelled like, the bodily experience of hitting it all so hard. It felt immediately like a visceral way to transform pain. And I hadn't realized how much my body needed something like that. So that experience offered both a theological foundation and kind of a practical invitation that supported what came out of the listening circles. So as I was preparing for this, I noticed I still have Officer Talley's business card on my bulletin board. And as Jackie shared, he was the one who supported our congregation after our Pride worship service was taken over by cyber terrorists early on in the pandemic. And he was the one that stood on my front porch. And so when we realized he was one of the 10 that was gunned down, it had another kind of connection to our community. So it was June 13th that in 2021, in collaboration with Raw Tools, we hosted a countywide gun buyback with the support of the Boulder Police Department in conjunction with the Colorado Attorney General and congregations throughout Boulder County, our sister churches in the UCC, the Colorado Poor People's Campaign, and Colorado Faith Communities United to End Gun Violence. It was a beautiful collaborative effort. And later we'll talk a little more about the ritual part of that day that happened after the gun buyback part. And would love to call on Kathy Stutzman first to share a little more about like the nitty gritty of making this happen. She spent hours on the phone figuring out the gift cards, and there are no instructions about that in our sacred text. So we're grateful to be able to share more about the logistics of how to actually get something like this going in your context.
Thank you, Nicole. We bring up gift cards right away. I always thought we were going to talk about insurance, which is so much easier. So one of the things that guided us in the logistics is that we had complete buy-in from our community. We had the groundswell, but we also had this divine presence of course, this is what we need to do. And so to give you the timeline, the massacre happened on March 22nd, social action met. We were dealing with what could we be doing? We were meeting with Mike and talking to our community, and took all of the answers that we had to our council on April 13th. And they approved us moving forward with all of this and really gave us free rein to make it so, and gave us complete support. And the next day we had $20,000 that had been given to us to move this effort forward. And the money kept coming, and it kept coming because people are so anxious to make something happen, and we were doing something. And we stayed true to our mission, which was we need to do something about gun violence. We never said we were going to end massacres. We never said we were going to we were going to take everyone's guns away. And that was really important because it helped us build partnerships. And those partnerships were really critical as we continued on with the planning stages. And so insurance actually ended up being very easy. And I'm not going to get into too many of the logistics, because when we worked with Mike, there's best practices for gun buybacks, if that's what you're going to do. And I know that Sarah's probably developed some best practices around doing the safes. And so we're happy to connect with you and email with you about specifics, but the best practices are going to be what your community needs and wants. And Chris even connected with other churches and brought some people in together. And so you don't have to do this alone. And there's so much willingness out there to be part of something important that's really, really important. So for us, a couple of the big pieces that worked for us, we had a very small planning committee. So it wasn't death by committee. It was 3 people. We were empowered to make all of the decisions. That made things very, very easy. We worked with Mike very closely. We had volunteers who came out of the woodwork. We did not know what to do with our 50 volunteers. We put them all to work, and we were grateful for them. And Jackie coordinated all of our volunteers. She's got has put into the resources our volunteer spreadsheet and some of the information, some of the resources that we used, our press releases, our logo. Our logo you can use that we're wearing on our shirts. You can use that. Just please feel free to credit the Community United Church of Christ. That would be great. And then insurance, it was really an interesting thing, because for us, insurance was, this is a ministry, this is an activity of our church. And so our insurance company said, if this is your ministry, we support your activities. And I just want to say one more thing about gift cards. Gift cards, we learned, is the best way that people launder money. We didn't know that when we were trying to buy $50,000 worth of gift cards, but we learned that very quickly. And so if you're going to be thinking about this and you really want some support in this, we're happy to help you do this. But there are really, really solid ways to do this, to purchase gift cards. And again, our resources will be listed. You can connect with me. We have a guide and a PowerPoint that we've created about buying gift cards. So, and gift cards are an important piece. We're an important piece of our process. As Sarah talked about, it is a donation. It's a donation, and then it's a thank you for the donation. It's a way of creating a transaction. For us, half of the people who came in and received gift cards donated them back to us. That gave us an opportunity to then re-gift them to both, I think 6th Street and the Denver Broncos and Longmont. So we've just kept gifting them on forward. So those are the big pieces about the logistics. Sarah, what would you like to add about the gift cards? Oh, I'm sorry, there is a question. I would like to respond to this. The gift cards were used. One of the best practices with that Mike Martin and Ratul has identified throughout the country is that certain kinds of guns get certain kinds of gift cards. So it's $100, $200, or $300. We had a medical group that wanted us to put $500 on if it was an assault weapon. We really wanted to stay with what the guiding practices were. And then they received the gift card after the gun has been, the unwanted gun has been disabled. Okay, Sarah.
Yeah, and those levels can be adjusted. I think the new levels that Mike is using now is 50, 150, and 250. And making it really clear that we don't accept ghost guns or air guns, and that ammunition is not accepted either. So the best practices, I'm sure, has all of that, and you're in really good hands when you partner with Raw Tools. So it was helpful to go second, and then Chris went third. So we all learned from each other, and we're continuing to learn. When it comes to gun safe giveaways, it's a much simpler event. As far as we know, people are not showing up with firearms. So they're just coming to pick up a safe. And so, as Kathy said, donations do come in. People are very interested in helping to finance these ministries. And so it's really just finding a quick access gun safe. We have found ones in the $65 to $75 price point have been the most effective. They can hold 2 or 3 handguns. We purchase batteries, and we just use a public space. So we have used the parking lot of the public safety building in town, which is well positioned so that we can just invite people in who are driving by. We also use some of the public spaces in Longmont, Roosevelt Park, which is the starting and ending point for a Veterans Day parade. So we will be having a gun safe giveaway. We have had and will have again for veterans and their families. And so we try to make it easy. And we also have a small team of folks who understand the machine and will help people set it up. So people leave with the machine ready to go. It's about getting the safes to the event, and then we give away everything we can, and then cleanup is pretty simple. But like Kathy and Jackie and Nicole, I'm happy to answer any questions offline. If there's a question that's come through, I'm not checking chat, but I think Jackie will get to that maybe. Okay, so
Sarah, I'd like to add one more thing. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I do want to give a big shout out to the UCC because we got a $3,500 operating expense from the UCC through the Solidarity Fund. And that was really an important moment for us, as well as some of the suicide prevention organizations. They donated in generous methods.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Kathy. UCC Longmont was also a recipient of funds from the United Church of Christ, and we are grateful. And so now we're going to go back to Mike and talk a little, and Mike's going to talk a little bit about the church as a prophetic witness.
Yeah, and I'll add that insurance, if you know who is the community UCC insurance provider, get with them, because every other provider I know has given me a bit of a pain in this. But all of that is part of this learning process. Every state to state is different, just like gun laws. It's very inconsistent across it, but you can find some spaces of welcome and grace too, and often from places you don't expect at every kind of nook and cranny of this whole process. So seeing the church as a prophetic way to enter into this work, I want to start with a quote from Walter Brueggemann that was a big part of starting Raw Tools. And essentially, he says, it's not whether something can be practical or viable or kind of ready to go. It's that whether it can be imaginable, and that when you start from that space, you then are able to ask if we've been so assaulted by the world conscious around us. He calls it the royal consciousness, that it's hard for us to think or even imagine an alternative thought, a different way of doing things. So we kind of find that in this world of gun violence, that our world says the best way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And the church gets to say, no, there's a better way to do that. And it's swords to plowshares. And so when I talk about being a prophetic witness, I think about something that Reverend Nicole said after the first one, that, there were 2 police officers there who were kind of in a nondescript space. So they weren't prominently featured at all, like you would see at traditional buybacks. And, their attitudes would change over time. And so other participants, even volunteers who are doing this for the first time, Reverend Nicole talked about, this is a slice of heaven that people got to witness, that cutting up the firearms, we get to witness into that. And that's really a big opportunity of entering into kind of the swords to plowshare framework of buybacks, of turning guns to garden tools, of cutting up guns. All the different pieces of this are a way for faith communities to be that witness to the world we want to build and be a part of, rather than being a witness to the world we want to escape. And so I think that this is a great way to do that. But the idea of being prophetic can also feel heavy and kind of even pious at times. And that's not what I mean here. I mean that we can imagine and allow the Holy Spirit to kind of help guide and direct us and move into spaces that are quite honestly very uncomfortable for the first time, and that it might feel vulnerable or safe. And so I often think about the story of Pharaoh's hardened heart, that the more he kind of sealed himself up, the worse it was. And we're constantly told by the world to harden our spaces and to make it harder for people to hurt us. Where then it's also at the same time, we kind of compromise the ability for people to help heal us when we do that too. And I think that's kind of the story of Pharaoh a little bit. So it's interesting that when we turn a gun into a garden tool, we have to soften that metal to turn it into something else. And so I think that's this journey of entering into these new imaginative spaces that are often imagined by the communities that we partner with. If we agree to partner with Community UCC or 6th Avenue or Longmont, they each have their different space that I would have never thought of to do things in certain ways without them lending their voice to that. And so, and they would also say the same thing about their other community partners that they work with, that everybody brings a new and imaginative piece to this. And it's such a collaborative work that you can't help but understand that it is a God thing, that is something is moving us all together that we would not be able to do on our own personally or without that life-giving spirit guiding us. And I think that this is really the powerful piece of all of this. Buybacks or even safe giveaways are almost always administered by law enforcement, and that can be a hard edge for people to interact with, depending on the communities that they come from, depending on abuse that they might have had from law enforcement. And so when we can create a new space for churches to be able to do this, to carve out that prophetic spot for us to speak our truth into the world, really invites a whole lot more transformation than you would have ever expected. And I just would invite people to be open to taking that next step, not necessarily knowing for sure how sturdy it's going to feel under your foot. And then I think that that's part of being in that prophetic space, is that it brings this accountability to what's happening around us, but also a restoration that calls us towards a new path. And so I'm really grateful for the folks on this call who decided to not just like hold hands together as we walked through this, but some of them like pulling us and running as we went forward, and we're all just trying to keep up. And I think each of us were kind of that pulling person at different places in this. And so it's been wonderful to work with you all and to see it expand, right? You didn't just get a national grant, you got a regional grant, you got people from in your own congregation, all of you here that are giving towards this because they see the value of getting guns out of homes. I noticed in the chat, someone asked if gun deaths have gone down since doing buybacks, and buybacks aren't the one all end all to ending gun violence or reducing gun violence, unless it's also brought in from policy advocacy, social issues, and other pieces in there, and funding from all the others. Each intersection of gun violence needs a different solution. So suicide is handled different than domestic violence or safe storage and accidental shooting. So all of those pieces can be touched on, but it's important to know your context and to be able to speak truth into that context and offer creative ways out of that. And so that as you build a coalition over time, states that have more buybacks tend to see a little bit of a decrease, but they also have an important piece of being able to get rid of unwanted firearms. And that's one of the biggest pieces to especially stolen firearms in reducing crime. And how beautiful is it that churches and faith communities can be a part of that narrative, that they get to decide, that they get to help speak our love into our communities, saying that we don't want you to die. And we have a way to not just take that instrument of death, but turn it into something that brings life to our community. And we'll be into the next section here about that transformation with Kathy and Jackie.
Yeah, we wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of ritual throughout our whole process. I think each of our congregations really embraced ritual in various ways to help us transform our trauma, to be 100% honest. And because gun violence, whether you're directly impacted or, kind of secondarily, it affects us. And it affects our bodies, it affects our psyches, it affects our spirituality, everything about us. And what better place than the church and ritual to come together to express our hurt, to express our anger, to express our trauma, and help them to transform it. And so our congregation, we've done a lot of different rituals from the very beginning. So on March 22nd, I told you I made, I don't know how many phone calls, and it became really clear that what our community needed that night after the shooting, while we still didn't know how many or who or whatever, was to gather together. And I guess we keep calling it a pandemic silver lining, Zoom, right? Everybody has access to Zoom in our congregation. And so one ritual we did right off the bat was do a Zoom vigil. And I couldn't tell you how many people gathered that night, but we cried, we told stories, we listened to each other, we shared, we processed, we prayed. And that night we came together in a way that might not have been possible, because we couldn't have gotten to our church building that night at all, unless you lived right there and could walk. But Zoom allowed us to be able to gather from all the places we were to be together. And it was so important to do that. Later that week, we had an in-person gathering when the neighborhood was open again. And both Nicole and I were present, our caring ministry team were present, and we had people come from the neighborhood, some from the church, just to be together. We had one woman, one of our caring ministers makes prayer shawls. So we gave away some prayer shawls. We blessed them. We had symbols that we placed on our lawn to memorialize the 10 people who were killed that day. And they were up there for months. They sat in our lawn for months until the wind blew them all away, which, has its own ritual in and of itself, right? But we're really wanted to create opportunities for people to name their grief, to move their bodies, because we know our body holds our trauma and our grief, our anger, our pain, and to be able to be in community, both virtually and in person, to really support one another. Nicole will talk a little bit about another kind of ritual we did, but we just received a grant as a result of all the people who wanted to give a lot of money in Boulder County after the King Soopers shooting. We just got a grant to provide some healing opportunities over the next year for people who are still experiencing trauma. So we'll be partnering with a nonprofit organization and then my horse ministry, and we'll be doing some sound journeys, some music, and movement to, again, help people transform their trauma, because even 2.5 years later, our community is not the same. People are still reeling. It's still hard to walk into the grocery store, which is now reopened and remodeled. So yeah, lots of ways ritual can be helpful. Nicole?
I know we're coming up on the end of time, so I'll try to be real quick here. So just to lift up the power I mentioned before, the demonstration where I got to go and with some of our people to sort of taste that first piece of hitting a gun into jewelry and garden tools. But after our gun buyback, we created a ritual experience where we marched from the site of the massacre, sang and prayed, and then on our site we had poetry, music, and a chance for people to line up and, you know, just hit the crap out of the gun pieces that we had collected earlier in the day. And Mike and Fred helped us do that. And the necklace I'm wearing comes from some of that experience. And just to end with 2 stories. One, the first person in line, I'll never forget. It was totally not who I would have thought and who law enforcement imagined. It was an elderly woman who had been widowed, and in her trunk, if I remember right, I think it was 2 long guns, like super long barrels. And I cried as that first one was cut up. And I'd like to end with this little part, with the ritual part, with what a young person wrote on Instagram about our event. She was, I think, 10, who came. She said, "Last weekend, I got to be a part of Guns to Gardens. Maybe it seems like the Boulder shooting at King Soopers, which was ages ago, but it wasn't. I still have nightmares. I can't leave my house without driving past the boarded up King Soopers and seeing the flashing blue police lights that are still there. It hurts. Gun buybacks make a tiny dent in a huge problem, but every gun that gets disassembled and melted is one less gun that can hurt someone. Being a part of a process of turning a tool of death into something that can make our world greener felt really good." So I'd turn it over to Sarah for some quick thoughts on all the surprises, and then we'll maybe close it out with telling you all how you can do this in your setting.
Yeah, I think we've done a great job of just acknowledging that partnerships come out of places that we don't expect. And so I just want to encourage folks to just pick up the phone, walk down the street, do what you have to do to have these conversations, and just trust that even if there is a no, there's another yes that's coming. So while we have partnered with other groups like Longmont Community Foundation and the American Legion, we also partnered with churches from other denominations and local and county law enforcement, who are all helping to support and create portals for making donations. So it's in your community. Just get out there and start asking. There'll be a lot of support. And so I think now what we're going to do is just maybe offer everyone just a moment to provide a closing thought. Chris, you want to go next?
Sure. I think my closing thought is just how, since we did that buyback in January, just how that has kept the conversation going. Now it's, September, and people are still talking about it, and still talking about, when can we do something again? And it kind of felt like it just was a spark that what people were looking for, and we're seeing the fruits of it continue.
I'll share my closing thought. I was surprised and amazed at the stories that we heard from the people as they brought their guns. and they brought their families guns and the reasons that they were doing it and the relief and the catharsis that they were feeling in freeing a burden that they were feeling. They were able to see their grandchildren again. They were able to tell a new family story. That was just an amazing celebratory time. And just feeling that celebration as people came through our parking lot was something I hold in my heart at all times.
And speaking of kind of the prophetic piece of this, each buyback, so you got 3 churches on the screen here, each buyback increased the amount of firearms that were turned in. And then because of these 3 churches doing these buybacks on their own, raising all the money on their own, counselors from the cities of Denver and Aurora reached out, and we scheduled 8 buybacks. We've done 7 of them so far, and we're on pace to bring in combination with the 3 churches here, about 1,200, almost 1,300 firearms since the first one. And so that's averaging about 100 to 120 per buyback, including a snowstorm that came through the night before one of these and nearly knocked it. We couldn't even do it at all. And so it really took the prophetic work of these churches to speak something into their communities so that other spaces could see what's possible. And that's really like a tangible thing to say, that now there are homes. 30% of the people who have been turning in their firearms don't have a safe way to store them. And so, they were most at risk for harm coming to them. And these churches helped make that happen.
Yeah. And when you ask the question about has gun deaths decreased in your communities, what I can say to that is, I don't know if gun deaths have decreased, but every buyback that I've been a part of, there has been someone that has turned in a weapon because they have not felt safe, that they were concerned about their own mental health. And so what we know is that that person's life was hopefully saved. And what we know when we give out safes is that we are making these homes a little bit safer. The message of keeping guns out of the hands of children and out of folks for whom it is not safe is taking hold, and people are starting to take it seriously. You can make a difference.
And just one more thing, in a time when it feels like so much is unraveling, this has given me hope, given our community hope, grown hope, and grown the movement. Like I feel like that matters, and that shifts culture, and that changes everything about what's possible. And as Mike said, about what we can imagine. So that's changed everything in a way, and there's no going back.
My closing statement would be, I just am so grateful to be part of this kind of ministry, and like everybody else, totally unexpected. Never in my wildest dreams would have thought that this would be a part of my ministry. And yet here we are, and how God puts us in places at the right time to offer our gifts and skills, whatever they are. Who knew? There's no seminary class about how to put together a gun buyback or what to do really when there's a tragedy in your own neighborhood. And you learn by doing and by gathering beautiful people around you, like all the folks in these squares who are talking to you today. I'm just really grateful about that. And I'll turn it over to Chris to pray us out.
Thank you, Jackie. So for each child who sits scared in a classroom, and for each shopper looking at the exits in a grocery store, for each home where a gun isn't locked up, and for each person whose heart jumps every time there's a loud bang, for them and for us, we do this work. It's easy to be jaded. It's easy to think we're helpless and nothing can be done. It's easy to say this is just too complex. But this work we are called to do. So may what we have heard today move us. May what we have heard today agitate us. And may what we have heard today inspire us. For this is holy work. So may God bless you and keep you. And may God's face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. And may God look upon you with kindness and give you peace today and in all your tomorrows. Amen.
Dear friends in Christ, if this conversation has moved you, if what's been offered here has enhanced your ministry or healed your soul in any way, please consider donating to support the annual fund of the United Church of Christ. Simply text UCC to 41444. Your support will help build more programs like this. We thank you for your support. Be blessed and be a blessing, and know that you are not alone. We are holding you in prayer. Amen.